Welcome to working with percents using equations. When we use equations, we have two key words that you really need to be aware of, and one of those is. If you see the word is, it represents equals, and if you see the word of, it means you need to multiply. And in these problems, when I show multiplication, I will either use parentheses to show multiplication, or I will use the multiplication dot. I try to stay away from using x because x is a variable that we use to represent an unknown value. So these are the two ways I will represent multiplication. All right, number one. When we are using equations, we will take words and we will turn them into math. So 60% of what? Okay, well right now I have 60%, and we know that that's 60%, but when I am playing with a problem, I can't have a percent sign. So I'm going to have to use what we know about changing percent to a decimal and make that 0.6. Then I see the word of, and I know that of means multiply, so I'm going to use my parentheses to show multiplication, and then it says of what? Well, I don't know what is, so there's an x, and then it says is. There's my equal sign, and then I've got a number 15.6. So I end up with a problem that says 0.6x equals 15.6. We're going to use our solving equation skills, knowing the equal sign splits it equally in half. I need to get this x by itself. Right now it's being multiplied, so the opposite of multiplication is division. I divide both sides by 6, and I get x equals 26. So I'm going back to my problem. 60% of 26 is 15.6. And that is the process we will work through for these problems. So number two, 204 is what percent of 96? So just as we see it, 204 is means equals. What percent? I don't know. I'm changing colors because I'm bored with green. Of means to multiply, and then you can see we have another number. So on the right side of the equal sign, I have x times 96. Obviously, the opposite of multiplication, as we just said, is divide. So same steps. If you have a number times x, you always want to divide. So I will end up with x equals 2.125. Well, unfortunately, that is not my answer because remember, go back to the problem. The problem said what percent, and my answer is a decimal. So equations are a little bit different than proportions in that you have to play with these percents to decimals. So I have to take this decimal and change it to a percent by moving my decimal 2 places to the right. So my final answer is 212.5%. And that's why equations can be a little bit more tricky than proportions. Number three, what percent of 90 is 18? So what percent? I don't know. Of 90, it means I'm going to multiply by 90. Is 18 means equals 18. So once again, I have x times 90. Opposite of multiplication is division. So I divide both sides by 90, and I get x equals 0.2. Again, go back and double check what your question states. This question says what percent? Change the decimal to a percent, and I have 20%. 20% of 90 is 18. Number four, what? I don't know. Is 33% is 0.33 of 260. So I multiply by 260. This one's kind of nice. You see that x is already by itself. So I simply multiply these two numbers together. And I say simply because you probably have a calculator, and therefore it is a simple problem. And you can multiply those together. If you were doing it in your head, it takes all the simplicity right out of it. Okay, so let's look at a story problem using equations. At a showing of the movie Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, which I've never heard of, 42 people were observed crying. If this represents 35% of the total number, look at that, 35% of the total number, so that's 35% of the total. This represents total in here. Do you know what the total is? Me neither, because that's what the question is. How many total people attended? But 35% of the total were observed crying, and that's 42. This would be a whole lot easier with proportions, I think, but I want to show you both ways. So if we divide by 0.35, right, once you set up the equation, the solving is just what we've been doing, and you would get 120 people. If you did it with a proportion, just real quick, you'd have 35 over 100. 42 is part of the population. We're trying to find out the total population that watched that movie. You would get the same answer if you solved it that way. Number 6, research study. 284 American adults responded that they have used an online dating or mobile app. If 2,252 adults were surveyed, what percent say they have not? Okay, this is how many people did. How many have not? So our first step would be to say, well, 2252 minus 248, that means 2,004 people have not used the dating site. So if I think about what this question is asking, it says what percent of the total, and the total is 2252, have not used it, right? Have not used. And we know that have not used, this last part, is 2004. So the way I've done it, what percent is I don't know of 2252 is the 2004, the ones that we know haven't used it. So if I divide both sides by the 2252, I end up with 0.88988, I believe. But we need that to be a percent, so I'm going to go ahead and just round up to 89%. So 89% of the people surveyed have not used it based on the wording of this problem. A survey of 68,000 addresses conducted by the U.S. Census found that 14.5% of the respondents were living in poverty. So 14.5% of the respondents. How many of them were living in poverty? So, well, if you can know, how many respondents were there? Well, they tell you that in the first part. So we know the total respondents is 68,000. So I know that 14.5% of 68,000 live in poverty. So if I turn that into a math problem, 0.145 times 68,000, that'll give me my poverty answer. And in this case, when you multiply, we know that 9,860 people live in poverty. And that is some work with equations.